Okay, let's unpack this because your brain actually processes the threat of, mispronouncing a word in a morning meeting with the exact same neurological alarm bells as it does a literal physical attack.
Right. It's wild.
Think about that for a second. You step up to speak, maybe you're, I don't know, trying to deliver a point in a second language, or you're just introducing a new concept to the board, and suddenly your mind goes completely, utterly blank.
Just a total void.
Exactly. The script vanishes, the vocabulary just evaporates. And it's not that you've forgotten the material. Your biology has essentially hijacked your cognitive processing power to prepare you to fight a predator.
It is a complete system override. And I mean, it happens in literal milliseconds.
Wow.
Yeah. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for logical thought, language formation, complex problem solving, it essentially just gets unplugged.
So, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're looking at a curated stack of sources from top language educators, performance coaches, and cognitive linguists.
And it's a fascinating stack of materials.
It really is. On the surface, the sources focus heavily on mastering English as a second language, but when you peel back the layers, what these transcripts actually reveal is while it's a masterclass in overcoming that exact physiological freeze response we just talked about.
Right. Because the literal subject is English, but the psychological tools here apply to pretty much anything.
Exactly. This deep dive is really about deconstructing the invisible barriers that stop us from acquiring any complex skill. Whether you are learning a language or picking up a new coding framework or just trying to find the psychological footing to speak up in a high stakes environment.
And for anyone listening, you, the learner, trying
Hmm.
to level up, we're going to map out how to bypass that threat detection system. We're going to look at the neurological mechanics of imperfect action
Yeah.
and how to build unstoppable momentum without, completely crashing your cognitive system.
Which, as the sources show, requires a pretty fundamental reframing of how we view skill acquisition entirely.
Oh, absolutely. We tend to operate under this illusion that if we just gather enough data, right?
Right.
Like if we memorize enough vocabulary, read enough textbooks, we will eventually feel adequately prepared to act.
Yeah, like you're just filling up a tank until it's full enough to drive.
Exactly. We wait for this critical mass of motivation or confidence to initiate the process. But the neurological reality that gets highlighted across all these sources is that motivation is actually a lagging indicator.
Wait, a lagging indicator, meaning it comes after the fact.
Right. It's a neurochemical reward specifically, a pulse of dopamine that follows the initiation of action. It does not precede it.
Oh, wow. Which perfectly explains why sitting around waiting to feel, ready to practice a language or to write that first line of code just results in chronic procrastination.
Because you are waiting for a dopamine release that your brain hasn't earned yet.
That makes so much sense. The action has to trigger the reward circuit. But initiating that first action is precisely where we hit the freeze that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's the wall everyone hits.
I really want to unpack the mechanics of this freeze because I always used to assume that when someone's mind goes blank while trying to speak a new language, it's a data retrieval issue. I assume the vocabulary just wasn't committed firmly enough to memory.
And the individual experiencing the freeze usually makes that exact same assumption. I mean, they blame their intellect or they think their study habits are just bad.
Right. I'm just not smart enough.
Exactly. But the mechanism of the freeze has very little to do with data storage. When you attempt to speak in a high stakes or novel situation, your amygdala, which is the brain's threat processing center, it initiates this lightning fast background check on your social safety.
It's running a massive emotional security protocol. Like in a fraction of a second, your brain is calculating, is the social hierarchy secure? Am I violating a norm? Am I going to be mocked?
Yes. And while it is running this incredibly taxing emotional algorithm, you are simultaneously asking it to retrieve foreign vocabulary, conjugate verbs, apply novel syntax, and physically coordinate your vocal cords.
It's just way too many jobs at once.
It's a massive spike in cognitive load. To use a sort of technological framework, human working memory is severely limited.
Right.
We can only hold a handful of discrete items in our active processing center at any given moment. So when you allocate 80 or 90% of that processing capacity to managing social anxiety and scanning the micro expressions of your audience, you only have 10% of your cognitive RAM left for the actual task of formulating a sentence.
And so the system crashes.
The system completely crashes.
It's like trying to render a massive 4K video while running 50 browser tabs and a heavy video game in the background, right? And then you wonder why clicking a simple text file causes the whole computer to freeze.
That is a perfect analogy. The hardware isn't broken, the bandwidth is just entirely saturated.
But this raises a fundamental conflict for me. If our biology is wired to treat the prospect of looking foolish as a, survival level threat, aren't we inherently fighting our own evolutionary programming anytime we try to learn a complex new skill? I mean, being a beginner fundamentally requires looking foolish.
What's fascinating here is that, yes, we are fighting millions of years of evolutionary programming. For our early ancestors, social cohesion wasn't a luxury. It was the primary survival strategy.
Because if you get kicked out of the tribe, you're dead.
Exactly. Being laughed at, ostracized, or rejected by the tribe frequently resulted in isolation, and isolation almost universally meant death.
Right. The stakes were literal life and death.
And our modern nervous system simply hasn't updated its software to distinguish between the existential threat of tribal exile and, the mild social friction of using the wrong verb tense at a coffee shop.
So you're standing at the counter trying to formulate the sentence like, I would like an iced latte, and your nervous system is just screaming, Predator!
Yes, it's flooding your body with cortisol.
Oh, man.
And because that cortisol spike narrows your attentional focus, you actually start misinterpreting environmental cues to confirm the perceived threat.
Wait, really? We misinterpret the cues.
Oh, all the time. You look at the barista or the executives in the boardroom, and if their faces are neutral, your panicked brain interprets that neutrality as judgment. You perceive a slight furrowing of the brow as this intense criticism of your intelligence.
When the reality is that the barista might just be running on 4 hours of sleep, or, your boss is distracted trying to remember if they locked their car.
Exactly. We project our internal threat state onto their neutral expressions. And because that physiological state of panic is so incredibly uncomfortable, our default coping mechanism is to retreat.
We just stay silent. We decide not to participate.
Right, because silence provides immediate relief. The cortisol levels drop, the threat passes, and you survive.
But the neurological cost of that retreat has to be steep, right?
Extremely steep. By choosing silence to escape the discomfort, you actively myelinate the neural pathway associated with avoidance. You are conditioning your nervous system.
You're teaching it that attempting to speak equals danger and retreating equals safety.
Yes. So the next time you find yourself in a similar situation, the amygdala will trigger the panic response even faster and with greater intensity.
Wow. So the avoidance actually reinforces the pathology, which brings us to the role of the reticular activating system, or the RAS, which the sources highlight as a really critical component in this feedback loop.
The RAS is fascinating in this context.
Yeah, I think most people listening are probably familiar with the standard explanation of the RAS, the biological filter that decides which sensory inputs make it to your conscious awareness. Like suddenly seeing the specific model of car you just bought everywhere you go.
All right, the classic car example.
But how does that filtering mechanism actively sabotage skill acquisition?
Well, the RAS operates based on the parameters you set for it, which are primarily driven by emotional salience and your internal narrative.
Okay, so if I tell myself I'm bad at something.
Exactly. If your internal dialogue is dominated by the conviction that you are terrible at public speaking or that you always freeze under pressure, you have literally programmed your RAS to actively hunt for environmental data that validates that hypothesis.
So you are instructing the filter to only pass through evidence of your incompetence.
Yes. So imagine you have a 5-minute conversation where 90% of the interaction goes flawlessly, but you stumble on one pronunciation and the listener briefly looks confused.
Let me guess, the brain ignores the 90%.
Your RAS Completely deletes the successful 90% from your conscious evaluation. It highlights that single micro-expression of confusion and flags it as mission-critical data.
You become neurologically blind to your own competence.
Precisely. Which is why understanding this underlying biology is the absolute prerequisite to mastering a material. You have to recognize that when you feel that overwhelming resistance, your brain isn't broken and you aren't lacking intelligence.
Your neurobiology is simply executing a threat avoidance program that, well, it's just no longer serving you.
Right. It's outdated software.
Which forces the question, how do we write a cognitive override? I mean, if the amygdala is redlining and the RAS is filtering for failure, we have to find a way to manually signal safety to our own nervous system.
And that's where the source material leans heavily into the concept of mindset reprogramming.
Specifically shifting from a fixed mindset, like I'm not a language person, to a growth mindset. I am improving. But I have to admit, I struggle with the standard advice here.
In what way?
Well, telling yourself I'm improving feels incredibly hollow, almost useless when your heart is beating out of your chest and cortisol is flooding your system. It feels like throwing a cup of water on a forest fire.
I mean, that is a highly valid critique of how mindset theory is often applied.
Yeah.
A growth mindset is frequently reduced to this sort of toxic positivity, which is neurologically ineffective.
Yeah, it just feels fake in the moment.
Because you cannot simply layer a positive affirmation over a state of physiological panic and expect the prefrontal cortex to magically come back online. The application of these concepts has to be systemic.
So it's not about in the moment cheerleading.
No, not at all. The sources suggest that the shift in mindset is about lowering your baseline allostatic load over time.
Lowering the cumulative wear and tear on the nervous system so that the spikes aren't as severe when they do happen.
Precisely. When you consistently replace rigid, permanent self-assessments like, I am incapable of public speaking, with flexible, process-oriented assessments, you are gradually altering the emotional valence attached to failure.
So saying, I will try my best instead of, this is too hard, actually keeps the brain calm.
Right. Because the goal of a growth mindset isn't to make failure feel good. The goal is to strip failure of its existential threat.
By decoupling your core identity from your current skill level. Like if failing at a task doesn't mean you are a failure as a human being, the amygdala doesn't need to mount a life or death defense.
Exactly. And that decoupling requires serious environmental curation. The sources reference the widely known concept that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Right, classic self-help advice.
But let's look at the mechanism behind that. Humans are highly attuned to social mirroring. We possess mirror neurons that subconsciously adopt the behavioral norms and emotional baselines of our immediate social group.
Okay, so if your peer group, either in your office or your social circle, reacts to mistakes with hypercriticism or mockery, your mirror neurons calibrate your own threat response system to match that baseline.
Exactly. If the group norm is that errors are catastrophic, your nervous system will treat errors as catastrophic, regardless of how many personal affirmations you recite in the mirror.
So curating your environment, whether that means finding new peer groups, joining learning communities, or even just cutting out complaining peers, is really an act of biological regulation.
It is. You're placing yourself in an ecosystem where the social penalty for failure is low. When the group norm celebrates imperfect action as a necessary data gathering step, your nervous system naturally begins to downregulate its threat response.
You are hacking your mirror neurons to normalize the discomfort of learning. And, speaking of imperfect action, the sources actually point out that done is better than perfect.
Yeah.
Imperfect action always beats no action,
Always.
which leads to what is arguably the most radical, counterintuitive advice across this entire stack of sources.
Oh, the grammar debate.
Yes. Once you've managed the physiological threat and curated a safe environment, what do you actually study? The sources present a roadmap that completely inverts the traditional academic model. They explicitly advise learners to abandon the study of grammar entirely during the initial phases.
They advocate for a total abandonment of explicit rule learning.
I have to express genuine skepticism here. I mean, I understand the desire to reduce cognitive friction, but if we ignore syntax and grammar completely, aren't we just mapping random sounds to isolated concepts?
It sounds chaotic, right?
Yeah. At some point, the adult brain requires a structural framework to organize those sounds, doesn't it? But isn't grammar the foundation of a language? Like, we aren't infants. How does ignoring the foundational architecture of a language actually lead to fluency?
Well, your skepticism touches on a massive debate in cognitive linguistics. It's the tension between declarative memory and procedural memory.
Okay, break that down for me.
When you study grammar rules from a textbook, you are storing that information in your declarative memory.
Right.
You are memorizing facts about the language, like this is the past participle, this is the rule for subject-verb agreement.
It's explicit analytical knowledge, like knowing the physics of how a bicycle balances.
Exactly. But speaking a language in real time is a procedural skill. It is a motor function coupled with rapid-fire pattern recognition, much like actually riding the bicycle.
You just get on and pedal, falling a few times until the body understands.
Right. You cannot access declarative analytical memory fast enough to support real-time procedural execution. If you are mid-sentence and you have to pause to access your declarative memory to check a grammar rule, oh wait, was it was or were, in or on? You introduce massive latency into the system.
You induce the freeze. You force the brain back into that active working memory bottleneck we talked about earlier.
Because you are trying to solve a math equation while performing a tap dance, it just forces you into an analytical mindset rather than a communicative one.
Which is why the sources advocate for the newborn baby approach, meaning babies learn through the four pillars: listening, reading, speaking, writing, by observing their environment, not by studying sentence structures.
Right. They rely on implicit learning. Infants don't learn language by studying rules. They learn by massive continuous exposure to the patterns of the language in context.
Their brains are just subconsciously tallying probabilities.
Yes, acting as statistical prediction engines based on sheer frequency of exposure.
But the obvious limitation of the infant model is that an infant is bathed in their native language 24 hours a day, right? They're surrounded by native speakers. An adult trying to learn English while living in Tokyo or Spanish while living in Berlin doesn't have that physical environment.
Which is why the strategy shifts to creating a synthetic internal environment. You don't alter your geography, you alter the medium of your daily life.
This is the passive learning concept. The sources suggest tactics like, changing the operating language of your smartphone, watching the news in the target language, or listening to podcasts during your commute.
Exactly.
But I'm curious about the real efficacy of this. If I have a French podcast playing in the background while I'm driving and I only understand maybe 20% of the vocabulary, is my brain actually doing anything productive? Or is it just processing it as white noise?
Oh, is doing something profoundly important, even if your conscious awareness doesn't register it. You are familiarizing your auditory cortex with the prosody of the language, the rhythm, the intonation patterns, the specific phones. Every language has a unique acoustic signature. By constantly exposing yourself to that signature, you are lowering the neurological novelty of those sounds.
Oh, okay.
When sounds are highly novel, they demand significant cognitive resources to process. By increasing the frequency of exposure, even passively, you reduce the processing power required to parse the auditory input.
So you are essentially preloading the auditory software. When you finally encounter a word in a context where you do understand it, the brain doesn't have to struggle to decode the sound. It already recognizes the pattern.
Exactly. It just has to map the meaning onto it.
Yeah.
Changing your phone's operating language is a brilliant example of this from the sources.
Yeah, that tip was wild to me.
But think about it. You check your phone perhaps 100 times a day. By changing the language to English, you are utilizing established contextual pathways. You already know intuitively where the settings icon is or how the download prompt functions.
So you are mapping the new vocabulary onto deeply ingrained physical habits. You completely bypass the need for rote memorization.
Precisely.
But passive exposure has a hard limit, doesn't it? I mean, listening to a podcast all day doesn't actually train your facial muscles to produce those sounds. You could build incredible auditory comprehension, but still completely freeze when you open your mouth because your vocal cords literally haven't built the muscle memory.
That is the exact hurdle. That transition from implicit auditory processing to explicit motor execution is where most learners stall out completely.
So, how did the sources bridge the gap between understanding what you hear and actually moving your mouth to speak?
They bridge this gap by applying the philosophy of marginal gains, specifically the 1% rule.
Oh, referencing James Clear's Atomic Habits, the idea that improving just 1% a day makes you 37 times better in a year.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But applying it directly to the biomechanics of speech.
Right, because where that framework often fails in language acquisition is the intermediate plateau. It's relatively easy to improve 1% a day when you are going from 0 words to 50 words. But how do you apply a 1% improvement to the physical friction of speaking when you already comprehend the language?
You apply it through a technique called shadowing.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Walk us through the mechanics of that. What is happening in the brain and the body during a shadowing exercise?
Shadowing strips away the cognitive burden of vocabulary retrieval and sentence formulation, allowing you to focus 100% of your cognitive resources on motor execution. You select a piece of audio from a native speaker, a short podcast segment maybe.
Okay.
You listen to a phrase, and you immediately echo it back out loud. You do not pause to translate the phrase into your native language. You do not stop to analyze the syntax.
You just mimic the acoustic output, attempting to match the exact speed, tone, and rhythm without thinking about it.
Exactly. You are acting as a real-time vocal mirror. It is a proprioceptive exercise.
Proprioception being your brain's awareness of your body's position in space.
Right. Every language requires a distinct set of muscular movements, specific placements of the tongue, varying degrees of tension in the vocal cords, different shaping of the lips. Your native language has heavily myelinated a specific set of motor pathways. Attempting to speak a new language requires forging entirely new motor pathways.
It's quite literally a physical workout for the vocal tract. The mouth feels clumsy because it is attempting movements it has never been optimized for.
And shadowing forces the motor cortex to rapidly fire and wire those new sequences without the bottleneck of having to think of what to say.
And the sources emphasize that this physical practice must commence on day one, right? Like waiting to speak until you have a massive vocabulary is a huge mistake.
A fundamental error. The progression they suggest is highly modular. You begin by narrating your immediate physical reality using single words. You look around your room and vocalize the objects. Table, bed.
You build direct neural links between the visual stimuli and the target vocabulary, totally bypassing your native language.
You are cutting out the middleman. The amateur approach is to see an object, think of the word in your native tongue, access the translation protocol, and then produce the foreign word. It's painfully slow.
So to achieve fluency, that translation protocol just has to be dismantled. You stop translating. You start with simple observations to build those direct neural pathways.
Right. From single words, you graduate to simple observations during a commute. I am driving. The sky is blue. I am tired.
These are low-stakes environments to safely practice, which builds to another daily tactic I loved, the 1-minute voice note. The sources recommend recording yourself speaking in the target language for 60 seconds every day. Just a voice note for yourself.
It is a profoundly uncomfortable exercise for most people.
Oh, I hate hearing my own voice.
Exactly. Human beings generally possess a strong aversion to the sound of their own recorded voice. Layering the incompetence of a novel language over that inherent discomfort requires significant psychological resilience.
But what's the psychology of the 1-minute voice note? Why is it so effective? Is it because it shifts the brain's processing state? Like when we are speaking in real time, our active working memory is fully maxed out just trying to survive the sentence, so we can't monitor our own errors.
That is precisely the mechanism. In real-time production, Your error monitoring systems are suppressed to prioritize continuous output.
Hmm.
But when you listen to the playback, your analytical networks come back online.
You become the observer of your own output.
Yes, you could objectively hear where your pronunciation degrades or where you consistently default to incorrect structural patterns. It transforms you from a passive student into an active participant.
You are generating your own feedback loop without needing a teacher to correct you.
And over time, as you review consecutive weeks of recordings, you generate irrefutable objective data of your own progression. This actively combats that RAS filtering we discussed. Your brain cannot claim you are failing when you have audio evidence of your fluency improving.
Which is critical because eventually you have to leave the controlled environment. Daily habits are great in the safety of your home, but what happens when you are in a real world meeting and the pressure spikes?
That's where the theory is violently forced to confront reality.
You step into a Zoom meeting, a client asks a complex question, all eyes are on you, and the allostatic load just spikes.
And the most vital insight extracted from the sources regarding these high-pressure moments is the demystification of confidence.
Right. The amateur belief is that confidence is a prerequisite state, that you have to feel confident before you can speak.
The sources completely invert that. They describe confidence as a lagging metric. One source used this brilliant analogy, describing confidence as a slow friend who is always late to the party.
I love that. You just have to start walking and trust that confidence will eventually catch up.
Neurologically, confidence is just the byproduct of dopamine release following a successful prediction error.
Wait, what does that mean?
When you anticipate a catastrophic failure, but you take action, and the failure does not manifest, your brain experiences a positive reward prediction error. It floods the system with dopamine, which subjectively feels like confidence. But you cannot trigger that neurochemical cascade without first taking the action despite the fear.
Okay, so in that meeting, the fear is present. The cortisol is high. You know you have to speak. What is the immediate physiological intervention to prevent the freeze? The sources emphasize manipulating the speed of your voice, right?
Yes. Consciously and deliberately decelerating your rate of speech is the most effective immediate countermeasure. When the amygdala detects a threat, the biological impulse is to accelerate.
You want to rush through it to get out of the spotlight.
But rapid, shallow speech further activates the sympathetic nervous system. It signals to the brain that you are indeed fleeing a predator. By intentionally slowing your cadence, you engage the parasympathetic nervous system.
A calm voice spreads calm. You're manually overriding the panic signal.
And it completely alters the interpersonal dynamics of the room. A rushed delivery induces anxiety in the listener, but a slow, measured cadence is inherently grounding. It projects authority. If you slow down, the room relaxes to match your baseline.
Which segues into a huge tactical shift regarding vocabulary under pressure. The sources tackle the pervasive myth of business fog.
Ah, the business fog.
The illusion that using highly complex multisyllabic jargon is necessary to project competence. This is a trap everyone falls into. We assume that big words equal intelligence.
But under pressure, big words are like heavy furniture in a small room.
Yeah.
You just keep bumping into them.
Exactly. The source shared that painful anecdote about a professional attempting to say, we need to strategically optimize our approach during a tense meeting.
And collapsing midway through the sentence.
Right. They ended up in total incoherence when simply saying, we need a better plan would have been perfect. But I have to ask, if you keep it that simple, do you risk sounding childish or unprofessional?
Simple isn't weak. Simple is sharp and strong. The deployment of complex vocabulary under stress is a massive misallocation of cognitive resources. When your working memory is already compromised by the pressure of the environment, attempting to construct elaborate sentences guarantees a system failure.
So simple language is the hallmark of unburdened cognition.
Exactly. The most effective communicators strip their ideas down to their core components. And the specific delivery mechanism for this is chunking.
Chunking. Don't try to build one giant perfect sentence in your head.
Right. Chunking is an artifact of working memory limits. The average human can only hold roughly 7 discrete items in their active memory. When you have a complex strategy to articulate, the instinct is to formulate one massive paragraph in your mind before speaking.
Which is impossible to hold in your RAM while